The new Amazon series Hunters looks at a group of vigilante Nazi hunters. It spans multiple decades, multiple continents, and the look of the series is due to my guest today, Curt Beech, the production designer. I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby. And Curt, when you start a project like this, where do you start? How do you even start creating a look for this show?
Well, for me, it always starts with a script. I usually only get the pilot script when I'm asked to pitch an idea for how things will look. So I'm sort of flying blind on what the arc of the characters are and where the story winds up going, and I'm trying to capture it, what I've read in just the first episode. And there's enough that happens in the first episode that there's a lot to latch on to. So for me, it starts with a pitch, and I create a pitch book with collages and visual ideas and sometimes illustrations of thoughts and ideas of how to approach each of the different characters. And I'll usually take on 2 or 3 of the characters visually and try and figure out what their spaces might feel like. And I'm really just trying to nail a tone and a vibe more than any specific set or look. Though I will try and get, as specific as I can afford to in that time. But I'm usually I have like 2 days to get ready, and then it's into the meeting, and I'm showing some visuals based on that.
So with that in mind, what characters did you start with? Where did you start with that?
I started with Meyer and Jonah. Of course, they were the 2 main characters, and that's a nice place to start because it's thematically they're covering 2 very different areas of the show, and there's good contrast there. So Meyer has a lot of money and Jonah does not. So we're talking about the Upper East Side in 1977 versus Jonah's Brooklyn in 1977, which was this is in the middle of the 70s when cities were emptying out and were basically bankrupt, so there were no services, and it was pretty dire in New York in the 70s. So we get to see some of that grittiness in Jonah's Brooklyn, and I was trying to sell that idea. One of the concepts that I threw out at the meeting was this idea of damage, for example, and I had a sheet of damage images from the period of broken down cars and televisions on fire on the street, things like that, selling the idea that, damage in this show is sort of a universal theme. There's every character in it is either damaged in some way or inflicting damage in some way. So we made an effort in the pilot, especially to try and put some of those images in the background of certain scenes, especially the exteriors that we were doing. There's always a bombed out car back there somewhere. So that was for Jonah's part of it. And then for Meyer, I was laying out a couple of different thoughts about what his places might look like. Is he sort of an austere person? Is it a little fancier, typical, traditional Upper East Side? And we wound up somewhere in between with his place, which is nice because when you get the ideas right in the pitch, then you're onto something, and everyone's buying in, and then that leads to bigger, better discussions and gets you closer and closer to the concept that you're going for eventually.
And that's interesting because I was speaking to the creator David Weil just yesterday, and one of the things he talked about was when he was a kid, hearing these stories from his grandmother of her survival. He told me he saw it almost like a comic book, and that was very much informed, how he created the show. And you have that sort of element. I'm thinking particularly of, where the hunters meet. Mm-hmm. Meyer's kind of, hall of justice sort of thing. Did comic books, influence how you kind of saw some of this stuff?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that set because that was the first thing that we had to build. So by necessity, that kind of lands as the first thing that we have to figure out. So that space was referred to as the Batcave in production as we were making it. So that's what we all called it. But and it was also initially written as a subterranean space, hence the Batcave that sort of stuck. But I felt like that had sort of been done before. And one of the big problems that you wind up with when you're doing a subterranean space is that you have no time of day. So there's really no way to tell if it's daytime or nighttime or where you are or what's coming. And so in order to get that, I kept moving upstairs, and I was like, all right, well, could it be an attic space? But then there's another attic space that's called out in the script. It's the Ark. And so I went even further up, and I was like, well, what might be on the roof of a space, of the townhouse like this? And then that got me thinking about water towers, and then I sort of landed on this conservatory space, like a greenhouse. But the problem with greenhouses is anyone can get into the greenhouse because it's glass. So one of the things that we did early on was look at glass block as a material that sort of got us into both the period. It's very 70s material, but it's also secure. You can't really see through it, and you can't get through it without, a sledgehammer. So we were able to get light into the space by using some glass block walls, but also have it feel like a secure space that no one could see into and that you couldn't really see out of, clearly. So, that was one of the first ways in for the Batcave, which then became, a rooftop structure. So sometimes it's a detail, sometimes it's a material that will get you most of the way, and that material got us going on that space. And and talking with the DP Fred Elms of the pilot, it was really important that we pump some light in there somehow, and that's how we went about it.
Because this show is dealing with such difficult subject matter, were there, particularly in the flashbacks of the concentration camps, how much research did you do into that era, and how much did that set pose a particular problem for you?
Yeah, it was a unique problem. We did a ton of research. I mean, I like to say that designers are only as good as their libraries, and I think that's very much true. And how you build that library doesn't really matter, but you have to feed your brain and know what you're looking at through what's been seen before, and how you adapt those things to create scenic environments. In the case of the concentration camps, a lot of different camps were called out, and it was going to be difficult to make each of them look exactly like the real thing. So what we wound up doing is thinking about them more as a tonal element, as a way to create the feeling of the camps without being documentarian about exactly what each one looked like. So we pulled some elements from different camps to capture the feeling, the tone, and the mood of the camps, but we were not beholden to all of the details. And it's a big point of departure, and it's hard to do these things exactly. If we had all the resources in the world, if we had all the money in the world, it would have been nice to do each camp as they looked differently. But we're not making a documentary. We're making a show that feels more like a graphic novel. So I think there's a little bit of leeway there, and we had to take some just because we didn't have the resources to make every single one. So what we found in the end was a standing set in Budapest, in Hungary, and we went to that place, and we actually fixed it up quite a bit because it had been exposed to the elements for quite some time. So we did most of our work there. And then we did some other things based on schedule concerns and logistics. We did some other smaller pieces in New York, but most of the camp elements were done in this standing set in Budapest.
Because the show is so eclectic and you're working with so many different locations, and some are very, very, true to life and feel very real, and then some feel kind of larger than life as by necessity. Is there a particular set piece that I always wonder if production designers go, is there a particular location or set piece that you just look at and go, yes, that's my favorite. That's the one that I had the most fun. That's the one that I knocked out of the park. Do you have one?
Oh yeah, I have one for sure. I think almost universally, a lot of the crew's favorite set was the recording studio, which we built from scratch, and we kind of went for it on that one, and it kind of nailed all the high points of the 70s, the colors, the textures, the vibe, the sort of smarmy 70s came off really well in that set. And we had some people in the set decorating department who had experience with recording studios, and so I was very proud that the elements of the recording studio were real, and people who came in were like, oh yeah, people who were in, musicians were like, this is exactly right, like this is where everything is supposed to be, the board is correct, the recording equipment is correct, and we were in all departments in that set. I feel like we nailed it.
It's interesting, because I think for a long time people used the term art director, and now the term seems to be more production design. Is there a nominal difference between the two? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, the production designer title, it's my understanding that it came about during Gone with the Wind because it was a much larger production. So the production designer title was born then. And then they sort of readjusted the names. And so essentially the metaphor that I use all the time is that the production designer is the architect of the film, and the art director is the project manager. So they're responsible for getting everything from the director's brain, or from the production designer's brain out to actual physical environments to try and make that happen. So, I mean, we're all working on all those things together, but the production designer is the architect and the art director is the project manager.
We were talking beforehand, and I'm a high school teacher, and you, it turns out, were a high school teacher, a theater teacher. How did you segue from that into this more design element?
Well, I was teaching technical theater, and I had been designing sets for the high school and helping the students also design as well. And I started to get much more interested in that part of the process. But at the same time, I was directing plays, teaching acting as well, all that stuff that high school teachers do in the theater department. So I went from there to graduate school at UCLA for theater, actually, for theater and opera design. And then once I got out of the program, I did not go back into a theater without a ticket. All the rest of my time was spent working on films, and I was sort of sneaking away from the theater department to go work on film projects during grad school. And then after school, started immediately right into film projects.
So when you take on any project, is there something specific that you latch onto when you're deciding on what project to take on? Is there something that draws you in?
Yeah, I don't know. I try to be fairly choosy about the projects. New York is kind of a big procedural town. There are lots of cop shows, right? That's sort of what New York is known for. And there, I've done one. I did a pilot of a cop show, and I didn't find it all that engaging design-wise. I sort of had to make things up to make it more interesting and to get my hooks in. So I've kind of resisted the procedurals for the most part. I'm really enjoying doing period pieces and stuff that's a little bit broader, but I'm always looking for a good script, a good story. And I was hoping to get this other project that was starting around the same time as Hunters. It was sort of a traditional wealthy, Upper East Side vibe kind of thing. And then this came up, and I was so happy that I didn't wind up doing that other project, because this is a much broader, much richer, much more interesting thing. Consequently, it's a little bit more difficult. And I think that worked in our favor. Everyone was working at their best and at their peak, and when given the more difficult projects, people tend to rise to the occasion, and this was no exception. The paint department really was stretched, trying to do some really interesting, different things. The materials are a little bit different because you're dealing with a period piece. The decoration is different because you're dealing with a period piece. It's all that much harder to pull off. And that's when people do their best work, myself included. So, this is the best thing I've done to date. And I know a lot of the crew felt the same way.
Well, it really is just such an accomplishment across the board. Curt Beech, thank you so much. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and stay tuned for more interviews throughout the season. Curt, congratulations. Thank you so much. Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Take care.